على عهدي على ديني على أرض تلاقيني، أنا لأهلي أنا أفديهم، أنا دمي فلسطيني فلسطيني فلسطيني، أنا دمي فلسطيني. موطني الجلال والجمال والسناء والبهاء في رباك والحياة والنجاة والهناء والرجاء في هواك عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد. سوف نبقى هنا كي يزول الألم، سوف نحيا هنا، سوف يحلو النغم. يا علم أرضي بحر أرضي حري مسروقة، أعطونا طفولي أعطونا طفولي أعطونا طفولي، أعطونا السلام، أعطونا طفولي أعطونا طفولي أعطونا طفولي.
حضن اليسوع محمدا ودم السماء توقد يتلوك،
أنت الفدا ولك الفدا، خاب الذين على المدى خلوك.
ستثور بك الأباء وتموت بك الطغاة وتعود لك الحياة.
فلسطين يا جرحي أنا يا شعب عمره ما انحنى، فترجعي انت لنا برمي أنا قلبي حاجة.
فلسطين يا جرحي أنا يا شعب عمره ما انحنى، تترجعي انت لنا برمي أنا قلبي حجر.
عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، ترحل كل يوم، تدور في أروقة المعابد، تعانق الكنائس القديمة وتمسح الحزن عن المساجد.
يا ليلة الإسراء يا درب من مروا إلى السماء، عيوننا إليك ترحل كل يوم، وإنني أصلي. Palestine, Palestine, oh Palestine, on your land Allah plays great signs. Though the world sees your scars and hears your cries, Allah is your God and you will survive. On that blessed night our prophets journey, when all prophets arrived there miraculously. In the Mosque Al-Aqsa Allah chose thee. You're blessed that your land was touched by defeat. Philistine, 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 Philistine. A history so great have we forgot. All faiths lived together in peace, did they not? Together they lived for the sake of God. A time you were held much sacred at heart. When I look to the people around me today, there's freedom of speech, yet they are afraid. It saddens my heart that it's this way. Can't we stand for justice? I feel ashamed. Philistine, 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 Philistine. We convey your oppressed ones wherever you are. We're with you right now, you're in our du'as. May the lost souls be among the shuhada. May your loved ones have reached their place in Jannah. The violence continues, bloodshed on streets. Children are dying now as we speak. We pray for the guidance of your enemies. We pray for your homeland, you will be free. Philistine, 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 Philistine,
نرفع الرايات سوف يعلمون أن نحن المسلمون قادمون. سأروي لطفلي حديث السماء، حكايا البراق ووقع النضال. هنا القدس آثار مسرى الهدى، وقبلة روحي وتاج الجمال. سنأتي إليك نشد الرحال ويعلو الأذان أذان بلال. سنأتي ببأس لأهل الخنا ونشفي الصدور بوأد الضلال، ونشفي الصدور بوأد الضلال.
سنأتي إليك نشد الرحال ويعلو الأذان أذان بلال. سنأتي ببأس لأهل الخلا ونشفي الصدور بوأد الضلال، ونشفي الصدور بوأد الضلال.
سنرجع عدلا مضى وانقضى ونعلو سجودا لرب الجلال. ومهما استبد العدو وطال فربي عزيز شديد المحال، فربي عزيز شديد المحال.
سنأتي إليك نشد الرحال ويعلو الأذان أذان بلاد سنأتي ببأس لأهل الخلا ونشفي الصدور بوأد الضلال ونشفي الصدور بوأد الضلال
سأروي لطفلي حديث السماء حكايا البراق ووقع النضال هنا القدس آثار مسرى الهدى وذكر النبيين خير الرجال وذكر النبيين خير الرجال
سنرجع عدلا مضى ونعلو سجودا لرب الجلال ومهما استبد العدو وطال فربي عزيز شديد المحال فربي عزيز شديد المحال
مناط السلام ومهوى المنى وقبلة روحي وتاج الجمال هنا الذكريات هنا الأنبياء وهدي النبي وصحب وآل هناك النفوس تسامت علاها وترقى وتسعى لوصف الكمال وترقى وتسعى لوصف الكمال
سنأتي إليك نشد الرحال ويعلو الأذان أذان بلاد سنأتي ببأس لأهل الخلا ونشفي الصدور بوأد الضلال ونشفي الصدور بوأد الضلال سنرجع عدلا مضى قضى ونعلو سجودا لرب الجلال ومهما استبد العدو وطال فربي عزيز شديد المحال فربي عزيز شديد المحال
تبارك الذي نزل الفرقان على عبده ليكون للعالمين نذيرا.
We're sending a strong message today. Let me hear you say free, 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 free.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you everybody for joining us for this very, very special program. Essentially, Palestine 101. We've been seeing, of course, the really tragic and heartbreaking scenes that we've been, all of us, seeing coming out of occupied Palestine for the last few weeks and even a month. And, all of these images that for many of us, unfortunately, have become all too familiar, but just as shocking. Assalamu alaikum once more. I apologize. We seem to have had a small technical problem there, but I believe I'm with everybody again. So just a very quick introduction and recap. I am Brother Eisa Ali. I am going to be the moderator of this event. Some of you may have seen me before as the moderator of the debates that we were having in the holy month of Shahr Ramadan. Some really interesting debates for the community, and touching on a number of different topics. And unfortunately, towards the end of the month of the holy month of Ramadan, we saw shocking and sad, but unfortunately unsurprising images coming out from occupied Palestine. And in the aftermath of the conversations that we were having following those debates, myself and a few other brothers and sisters had a conversation about perhaps doing another program like this one, Palestine 101, to learn more about the situation there from a historical perspective, from a media perspective, and even from a perspective of our religious understanding of what's going on in Al-Quds, which is, of course, a holy city, not just in the Jewish or Christian tradition, but also, of course, in the religion of Islam as well. And what we've decided to do is we've gathered up what I believe is an A-star lineup, really to try to break down in detail, as much detail as we can, the issues in occupied Palestine. The question of how did we get here? This is not just a decades-old problem, it's a centuries-old problem. And so for those reasons, we decided to hold this event and to invite the speakers, and we will try to keep it as relaxed and interactive as possible. I'm going to introduce, inshallah, our guests who will be joining us throughout the course of this program, and we also will be welcoming everybody to submit their questions or comments. You can do that via the YouTube comments or live chat as well. Our first speaker is Sister Batool Subeiti. Inshallah, Sister Batool will be opening the program with a speech, and her speech will be around 15 minutes, and it will go into the history of Assalamu alaikum, sister. I just want to give a very quick introduction of yourself, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. Sister Batool is a graduate chemical engineer from the University of Birmingham. She has a special interest as a political analyst in the Middle East and focusing on Western Asia and also Western foreign policy towards the region. The sister has written for news outlets such as Modern Diplomacy and the Tehran Times, and I believe also you run your own WordPress blog, Stances to Salvation. Sister Batool, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and I just want to perhaps begin, because I know you're going to be speaking for about 15 minutes, but I also want to perhaps ask a question that will lay the groundwork for your speech, and that is that, you know, there are many people who look at the conflict, even I shouldn't call it a conflict, the occupation of occupied Palestine, and perhaps lack the background, the context, and how far back exactly this goes. And you know, this is, as you're about to introduce to us, something which is it's a 100-year history, is this not, this situation in occupied Palestine, or even possibly more than that?
Yeah, absolutely. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد عجل وجههم. Thank you so much, Brother Eisa, for that lovely introduction. And I just want to start off by, of course, thanking the organisers for inviting me and for the rest of the speakers. Of course, I look forward to hearing your contributions. Just before I actually begin, also, I want to clarify that when I refer to the state of Israel, I use the term the wrong state. I think it's very important that we try and reclaim the narrative and don't do it based on how a mainstream media does the dictation. So when you hear me saying that, then you know what I'm referring to. Yes, of course, as you alluded to, Brother Eisa, this goes way before. Of course, when people think about what triggered the recent uprising and the recent massacring of the people of Gaza and throughout occupied Palestine, they think of Sheikh Jarrah, they think of Silwan, for example. But as we know, of course, this ethnic cleansing, I would say, even dates, as you said, 1948, so even before that, the ethnic cleansing at the point where it began, in that kind of meeting point between the imperialists and the Zionists. So I think just to start off, I want to begin by just defining some terms, just to make sure that everyone who is viewing is on the same page. So when we talk about Zionism, what is Zionism and where did this all begin? So of course, the Zionist movement, this emerged during the beginning of the 19th century, and it espoused the formation of a nation state for the Jewish community. People may be interested to know that Zionism actually began as a Christian project even before it was a Jewish one. So Zionism was actually a part of the internal debate within evangelical Christianity. These Christians believed that the return of the Jews to Palestine would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, and the conversion of Jews to Christianity or to hell. So actually what drove them to advocate for Zionism was their anti-Semitic position. And these same Zionists, very interestingly, were actually an important base for President Trump and his ilk, who worked to provide that immunity for the wrong state's policies on the ground. So then, when the Jewish intellectuals adopted Zionism, this is in response to anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. Interestingly enough, their antagonists, the antagonists of the Zionist Jews, were mainly other Jews. So they were the Orthodox Jews who saw the premature return to Palestine as actually tampering with the will of God. Now, the ultimate question here is, how was the Zionist vision actualized, as you refer to, Brother Ali? Brother Isa, sorry. So, of course, there was a crucial meeting point in the interests of the dominant imperial powers at that time. So you had Great Britain on one hand and the Zionists at another hand. So Britain recognized that in order to sustain and to increase its colonial control, it needed to create for itself a military base that serves as an extension for it in the strategic location of West Asia. So Palestine was ideal. Why? Due to the nature of the strategic location. So of course you have the Suez Canal, to the history of the land. That was very important, as we know how that's today used as a pretext to justify the legitimacy of the wrong state. And they wanted to ultimately plant a foreign entity within the neighboring Arabian lands. So the idea was that the West wanted this military base to actually act as a disciplinary stick for it. And this continues until today. You know, we see the wrong state's role today is to act as a stick for which superpower? For America. It's used in order to punish other entities in the region that fail to obey US orders and US interests. And it's no wonder that the wrong state has fought over 15 wars since its inception between all of the neighboring countries. So the equation is as follows. The Zionists themselves, they are hunters for sources of power in the world that can actualize a Jewish homeland. And wherever the imperialists place the Zionists, they will follow. And that is why you find that if we look back to the founding protocol of the Zionists, there were actually initially discussions over the creation of this Jewish homeland in British East Africa. So this was suggested by the founding father of Zionism, whose name is Theodor Herzl, in 1903. But obviously Britain wasn't happy with this because it didn't serve their interests. So the Zionists essentially were just playthings at the hands of the imperialists. And we see this equation today. They continue to be driven by them. So it's interesting that even if Zionism itself wasn't a phenomenon at that time, then the forces of colonialism that used Zionism to serve their agenda would go to the extent of even creating a Zionist movement if it wasn't already existent in order to achieve their goals. And interestingly, this is something that actually President Biden himself said at one point. He said, if there was no Israel, then we'd have to invent one. You know, so what does this imply? It implies that America is actually the head of the snake here. Whereby the Zionist state is effectively bound by the American interests today. And if you find that there's a real difference between the two, then the Zionist state would only submit to American orders, since the wrong state's financial and military existence is completely linked to America and can't be disconnected from it. So of course, we see that today America is actually assuming the role of Britain pre-1948. So now, of course, back to the main discussion, because I don't want to digress. The Zionists, they reached their targets through facilitating the interests of imperialist Britain. And this materialized in what was famously known as the Balfour Declaration. So this motion was passed by the British government before the end of World War I. It called for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And so to garner support for this, Arthur Balfour stated within his declaration that, you know, nothing should be done that may prejudice the civil or religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So in the process, and I think this is actually very important to mention here, the Zionists and their imperial masters, they weaponized the anti-Semitism that actually existed within sections of the people. And they activated this into a slogan that was actually used to justify the containment of settler Jews in Palestine. So, it shouldn't be surprising to us, for example, if we hear that there was such a thing as an Aliens Act that was passed in 1905, when Arthur Balfour, the author of the Balfour Declaration, was actually Prime Minister of the UK. And this Aliens Act essentially sought to curb Jewish immigration into the UK. Or it shouldn't be surprising to us that Balfour, himself espoused very openly what was considered anti-Semitic sentiment. So, for example, he called Jews an alien and hostile people. And I think today, of course, we're all too familiar with how anti-Semitism is being used as a tool to actually blackmail those resisting the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians into accepting this new reality and really seeking to stifle voices of resistance. So, for example, you have the IHRA definition today. So it stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. It is literally codified within the law that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And this, in fact, played a very pivotal role in the smearing of one of the most well-known and anti-racist and social justice campaigners of our time, Jeremy Corbyn, of course, that relegated him from a single position away from being prime minister to effectively being suspended from his own party on false charges of anti-Semitism. So, I think it's very important to know that the same perpetrators who actually carved up Palestine like it was a piece of bread and legitimized the ethnic cleansing, they are the same entities that actually sought to activate anti-Semitism. And they sought to take advantage of Jewish suffering and to create it as a political tool that could essentially cover up their crimes and that could further silence the natural human outrage on this oppression, which continues until today. So moving on, the British Mandate de facto came into effect in 1923, and it was based on the illegitimate Sykes-Picot Agreement. So this essentially sought to carve up West Asia, and that's what it did, by the imperialists. So you had Britain and you had France, and it was based on false promises. So when Zionism became a settler colonial movement on the ground, with the building of Jewish colonies, with the formation of their own institutions and leagues, this was during the British Mandate, post-1923, the Palestinian national movement, of course, they perceived Zionism as an existential threat to the indigenous people of Palestine. And of course, this turned out to be valid as transpired with the Nakba in 1948. So that was the ethnic cleansing of the people of Palestine. But as we've mentioned, the ethnic cleansing actually began before the Nakba, before the official creation of the wrong state and its legitimization on the international scene. The Palestinians were living in a nightmare. You had the Great Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939, where you had over 10% of the adult male population were either killed, wounded, exiled, or imprisoned. And just before the Nakba transpired, so this is before 1948, at that point in time, Britain withdrew from Palestine. It handed over Palestine to the UN. And the UN is officially what founded Israel. So in its partition plan, 55% of that land was falsely given to Israel, and 45% was to almost remain for the Palestinian. That's the way it was framed. Like 45% will remain for the indigenous people. And even that was supposedly. Although Palestinians, of course, they formed up to 70% of the total population. So you can see the layers on top of layers of the injustice just from the onset. And you had Zionist terrorist organizations like the Haganah, Stern, Ergun, which all united to form what became known as the Israeli Defense Force. They actually went against international law and the UN and captured 78% of Palestine. And in the process, they completely erased over half of all Palestinian villages, forcefully expelling and ethnically cleansing half of the indigenous population at large. And with over 100,000 Palestinians massacred, this Nakba continues until today and has been a reality for the past 73 years. In Arabic, we call it a Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing continuous Nakba. And we see that actually today, a third of all refugees in the world are Palestinians who are completely denied the right to return back to their homelands. In contrast to Jews from across the globe who are encouraged to actually gain citizenship of the wrong state, all whilst Palestinians considered to be forcefully expelled from their homes, as we see today, of course, with the outrage on Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan in occupied East Jerusalem, which are just a little snippet of what happened en masse in 1948 and continued to happen. So what makes the Palestinian catastrophe unparalleled to any other oppression that has occurred and that continues to occur? It's that the formation of the wrong state, the formation of Israel, was a settler colonial conspiracy project. It was the biggest of its kind. It was founded by the global hegemonic ruling system solely to serve their interests. You know, the whole world superpowers conspired to uproot the Palestinian nations, all whilst the other nations turned a blind eye. You know, so for example, you have the USSR. It was the first government to recognize the illegitimate establishment of the wrong state. And they actually sent large swathes of Jewish settlers there. And of course, the US, it presumed the role of Britain, you know, post World War II. So what does the Nakba remind us? The Nakba crucially reminds us that even international law itself is erected on the ruins of the occupation and aggression of the Palestinians, since it was international law that from the onset gave recognition to the wrong state. So even international law itself doesn't come close to reversing the biggest shame to have occurred, and therefore granting Palestinians their full right in a just full manner. You know, simply demanding for the dismantlement of the illegal siege on Gaza or the occupation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and stopping there is like the equivalent of demanding crumbs from one's stolen bread to be returned back to its owners. And we see that even the demanding of these crumbs, that isn't being applied. And that's why if we look at all the decisions of the UN, we see that actually most of the resolutions aren't even applicable and are not even suiting the situation when the balance of powers change. So most of the resolutions we see, they actually remain on the shelves. Take, for example, granting Palestinians the right to return. So the UN and the Security Council resolutions, I want to make this important point. It's not this holy book. You know, for the UN, its morality isn't its yardstick. We crucially know that it is the balance of forces on the ground that dictate the nature and dictate the direction of the decisions taken, which actually themselves represent the compromises between the superpowers that is based on their interests on these matters. So let me give an example. It was in the interests of the superpowers to grant the Zionists 55% of the land. And that was considered legal in 1948. But in fact, you know, today, which is the 5th of June, it might be a coincidence, it's known as Nakba Day. So the wrong state's illegal occupation of the remaining Palestinian territories in 1967. So the question here is, why is that considered illegal? Why is it considered illegal for the annexation of Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, whilst the partition plan itself, which saw the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians and their uprooting, that was considered legal. You know, both of these implicated ethnic cleansing, you know, but what does this tell us? That is because the very fact that one is legal and one is illegal is because any resolution that comes out of the UN or such international bodies is itself dictated by the interests of the superpowers. So, for example, how big they want the state to be, or when it falls outside of their conditions, so they want to bring it back and then therefore declare it as illegal. You know, so further to that, we've seen how the deal of the century, which was proposed by Trump and his son-in-law, it abolished all of the previous laws of the UN in return for bribed money. For example, Palestine had to forego Jerusalem. So why did they abolish the previous decisions? That is because they felt the balance of forces, so this is the American administration at that time, felt the balance of forces on the ground was on their favor in Palestine. And there is this kind of outside force that was getting stronger. And of course, they wanted to end the Palestinian cause. And they wanted to bring all the Arabs that would agree through this Israelization process that was known as the Abraham Accords. So what does this show us? This shows us that the superpowers themselves are not acknowledging the decisions that have been put forth by international law. That's not only the case that they haven't applied any of these resolutions, they themselves change these very resolutions. So interestingly, the whole talk of this two-state solution, it's been revived after the 11-day war in Gaza, after they realized the strength of the resistance forces on the ground in Palestine. So I'll end by saying this. The only solution that would force the superpowers to either abide by its decisions that are not being acted upon, or to overcome all the decisions according to the new equations on the ground, is through changing the balance of forces. And that could only come about through armed struggle and armed resistance. You know, what seemed to be this undefeatable army, the wrong state's army, that sought to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates, it was due to the resistance on the ground in Lebanon and Palestine, that it began to deteriorate, that led to its unilateral withdrawal of the wrong state from South Lebanon in 2000, the unilateral withdrawal of the wrong state from Gaza in 2005, its illegal occupation. These were areas, by the way, that the wrong state never dreamed of leaving, because we have to understand that the Zionist settler colonialism is expansionist in its nature. The aggressiveness that it displays in expanding is essential in changing the land from a military base, which, as we discussed, that's what the West wanted, to a real country capable of surviving. And that's why when, for example, Ariel Sharon, when he led his army into the heart of Lebanon during the invasion in 1982, and he was asked what the borders of the wrong state signify, he said the borders are where our tanks stand. And so because of the very resistance today that we see on the ground, this very statement of Ariel Sharon is obsolete. So we've reached the stage where the current strategy of the wrong state is to simply weaken its enemy, whilst before the enemy was such that it couldn't be felt. The current strategy of the wrong state is simply of surviving. And you have to also take the strategic implications on the ground when it comes to America. You know, America, the wrong state represents a heavy burden on America's shoulders. And the entity right now we see is fighting the battle on behalf of the wrong state, which is America. We see that it's even withdrawing from the region because their plots have been defeated. So it's no doubt that the US will consider foregoing Israel when it becomes an obstruction to US interests in the region at large. And so, okay, I think I'll stop there because I've been going on.
No, it's fascinating, and thank you so much, because as you know, we've asked you to come and talk for 15 minutes, but it's something that, if you go through every era of everything you try to touch on, you can speak about each one of those eras for hours and hours. There's so many layers to it, but that was a beautiful way to start the conversation, because it really livened things up. And I want to come back on that last point you made, maybe later in the show, because obviously earlier in your speech you said that perhaps it was the colonialists leading the Zionists, and there are some who would argue now the power balance may have shifted and it's Israel calling the shots. And there's always this debate going on. Maybe we can get into it later, inshallah. Thank you so much, Sister Batool, for that wonderful, really opening to tonight's program. Inshallah, it's my honor to introduce our next guest, who is a colleague of mine and a former colleague of mine. We used to work together, Sister Nargess Moballeghi. She is a journalist and a producer. We worked together at Press TV. She was my boss at Press TV. And, really, we've both come a long way since then. We've been in the trenches together on a lot of these topics, and I think I want to get into her background as well and her introduction, because I think this will help to contextualize the understanding of everything that we've seen. So Sister Nargess is an international news broadcaster. She's been working in the industry for 15 years. She was one of the senior anchors at Press TV, and really covering all of these topics, the flotilla, the previous attacks on Gaza, and doing so from the region as well, which is such a unique place to be, a unique perspective, because many of us journalists who are here in the West, we're kind of the counter voice in a context that is very pro-Israel, and yet to be in the heart of what some term the axis of resistance, reporting on all of these issues gives a real unique insight into some of the influences at play. And Sister Nargess as well. I mean, look, just at the end there, we heard Sister Batool talking about the conflict and how things have shifted in terms of on the ground. And she touched on briefly as well issues such as the weaponization of anti-Semitism and the kind of smear campaign against Labour that we saw, especially under Jeremy Corbyn, for the last 5 or 6 years. And you're somebody who's covered these events, like as I mentioned in the introduction, from the region, from here. And I guess my question or my point to you is that you're kind of more well placed to say that why do we see such biased coverage on something which many people say is a black and white issue? It's a question of settler colonialism. And I was showing a few friends of mine who are not from the region, let's say, from their background, but are sympathetic to Palestine, video, for example, of certain roads in occupied Palestine that are, for example, only accessible to Jewish settlers. And I said to these friends, imagine this is South Africa, and there's a road or a fountain that says whites only, blacks only. There would not be these both side kind of mealy-mouthed explanations. It would be clear cut. And yet, when it comes to the question of Palestine and Zionism and the occupation, there seems to be this alternate reality how things are reported. And I just wanted to maybe get your perspective on it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, salam, and it's good to see you. Yeah, that kind of neatly bridges over to what I've been asked to speak about, I suppose. And I hope by the end of the discussion, I would have answered it. I think it's a lot to do with the history and structures of how journalism works in this country, and maybe how things have changed, also to do with how the media's changed over the last, especially 2 decades. And that's what I've been kind of asked to talk about, and it neatly wraps into your question, which is to talk about the media coverage on Palestine, specifically if there is fair coverage in the mainstream media, and if not, as you asked, what the current challenges preventing this from taking place are. And also I was asked to discuss if there has been a shift in the narrative in the mainstream media. For example, is the media's narrative more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause now? And I think the simple and clear answer to the first part of that question is that, as you said, we know that there is not fair coverage on Palestine in the mainstream media. And it's important to know that that is not just something we feel as people who have been engaged in this topic, or as you said, someone who's been in the Middle East and seen how widely different the coverage is to here in the West, but that's something that's backed up by facts, by different academic and analyses and research. So study after study has found that there is consistent underreporting of Palestinian deaths and overreporting of Israeli ones. So just to give a few examples, for example, in the United States, in a 1-month period, CBS was monitored and it reported 202% of Israeli deaths and only 54% of Palestinian deaths. Or I think an important one is studies done on the Associated Press, which is found to report on Israeli deaths at a rate 2 times higher than Palestinians. And as me and you know, Isa, that Associated Press, or AP, is basically a news wire. So it is where all other news organizations get their information from. So if that is underreporting Palestinian deaths, it then seeps through to everywhere else. For example, here in the UK, in 2004, the BBC commissioned the Ballon Report, which was on its coverage of Israel and Palestine, and then it basically refused to publish its findings, and it fought a legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court to stop it from being made public. But we know anyway from other smaller reports that have come out, for example, in 2006 by the BBC itself, that they found that their coverage, and this is their words, implicitly favors the Israeli side. Israelis receive more airtime, and their deaths receive greater coverage. So, I mean, those are just some of the facts and studies and reports. Sometimes it's good to arm yourself with this data, especially as you said, Isa, sometimes you're talking to people who you need to open up this discussion and still prove these points. But I think really for us, it's not even a question at this point. We know the coverage isn't fair. To the second question, yes, there has been some shift in the narrative in the mainstream media, though I would posit that this is not by choice, or at least we could say it is a reaction rather than by some proactive or fundamental editorial change. And I think the best way we can understand the media landscape today is to look at how and why it's changed over the last 2 decades. And that's what I'm going to try and do in the next 10 minutes. And that last 2 decades covers just about, give or take a year or two, the time I've been studying and working in journalism. So I started my degree in journalism and psychology in 2003. And at that time, the fastest paced news you were going to get here in the UK, at least, was your 24 hours rolling news station. And at that time, that was basically Sky News or BBC News 24, which at that time was relatively new. It'd only been on air for about 5 years, I think. And it was still a world of newspapers. So you still waited for the front page every day. And that was what being a journalism student was about. You would go in every day into university and there'd be a table full of newspapers, and that's what you would trawl through. And I went to City University, which is in London. So you would expect it to be more diverse than other universities, but my journalism course was overwhelmingly white. So that goes for the lecturers and that goes for the students. And that pretty much reflects journalism as a whole. In fact, at City University, a 2016 study found that British journalists are 94% white, they're only 0.4% Muslim, and they're only 0.2% Black. And that does matter when we think about why coverage is the way it is, or why it was that way at the time. If what your news is basically restricted to only the pages of newspapers with specific editorials, overwhelmingly and disproportionately written by one demographic, it's going to have an impact. And the consequences of that on a topic like Palestine was that it was, and to a large extent still is, incredibly difficult, if not near impossible, to find a way to penetrate the establishment storyline. And that's just the way it was. Now, during my last year of universities, 2 websites launched, Facebook and Twitter. Nothing really to do with the news at that time. And to be honest, none of us imagined at that time how it would change journalism all the world. We didn't call them social media sites. Social media wasn't a term like that. There was no social media module at university. It just didn't really exist. What I was more interested in at the time, graduating, were 2 new 24-hour news stations that had launched in my last few months of university, and that was Al Jazeera and Press TV. And they were both coming out of the Middle East, Qatar and Iran, as you mentioned. And really, that was the start of the alternative news era. In fact, shortly after graduating, that's where I started working at Press TV in Tehran. And I know now we have social media as a form of news, but then we didn't. And it was really alternative news that came in and dented or loosened the stranglehold of the mainstream narrative. And it was literally a game changer for Palestine in the English-speaking world at the time. Go ahead.
And say that there was a hunger for that type of media, because we'd seen what happened in the lead up to the Iraq war. Many people didn't buy into the official narrative going into that war. We saw protests of millions of people. And I would argue that they were so fed up in that period from 2003 to 2009 with how the mainstream media had handled everything from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from all of these topics which people were upset about. And so by the time social media came along and those channels, you had a ready, willing, waiting audience just kind of hungry for this type of alternative view.
Yeah, I think so. I think certainly the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war, you know, are the concept that what is happening over there is not actually what our government is telling us, had been solidified. It had been solidified. And we had already seen, for example, in the run up to the Iraq war, you know, those massive protests and the disparity between what was happening on the ground and what the media and politicians were saying. So, yeah, I do agree with that. I think that Britain was going into war in Iraq and it was happening there and then. Whereas even now, I would say Britain's involvement in Palestine, in its creation, in the creation of Israel, is maybe not as so much in the forefront of people's minds. I think definitely whether that was the case or not, and I think you're right, it was the case. One of the big things that happened with alternative media, and we can see it in the 2009 Gaza war, and that was really a pivotal moment. It was like a watershed moment because it was 3 weeks of aerial and ground war that left about 1,400 Palestinians and 13 Israelis dead. And as you mentioned, I was a news anchor for Press TV in Tehran at the time. And what had happened was that Press TV, alongside Al Jazeera, was giving almost 24-hour back-to-back news coverage of the war. And importantly, it was using Palestinian journalists. So Yusuf El Helou, who is going to be speaking, I think, after me, he was my colleague on the ground in Gaza at the time. He was risking his life every day in the 2009 war. And we were providing live streams of the reality of what was happening. And what that meant for your viewer in London was that for the first time ever, you would be flicking through your skybox, through the news channels, and you'd cross over to the BBC, which probably had a reserved news anchor talking probably to an Israeli official who was probably saying something about having to defend themselves against terrorists. But if you literally just flicked up and you're just scrolling and you stopped at Al Jazeera or Press TV, you were suddenly met with these chaotic scenes of children injured, bombs on schools, dead mothers. And these two stories didn't add up. And viewers really at that time started asking questions about the narrative. And this played, I think, no small part at the time that we saw the biggest pro-Palestinian demos in the UK we'd ever seen at that time in 2009. Obviously, by the 2014 war on Gaza, it was a completely different landscape. Yes, alternative media had consistently been like pushing the boundaries, the goalposts, and putting pressure on mainstream, but we'd seen through the Arab Spring, for example, in 2011, how social media and Twitter in particular could play a role. And so now it was really about social media as grassroots journalism. So social media was now increasingly the news cycle, and mainstream outlets were either playing catch up or ultimately being forced, however reluctantly, to concede some space and coverage because of the virality of social media.
And so the current conflict, then isn't that what happened? Because there were many people who noticed, for example, the Sky News coverage of this particular round of Israeli attacks on Gaza. Many people were actually left quite impressed by it, and there were some who were looking at the correspondent. I think his name is Mark Stone, who's based there, and he was essentially telling it as it was and very forward. And there were many who said that whether he meant to or not, the simple reality was no one could escape it. Everyone was on Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, whatever apps they were on, being confronted with the reality of the conflict there. Israeli soldiers having fun on TikTok while Palestinians are being murdered. And so there wasn't the same space in the mainstream to try, they still did, but to try to make it as, oh, the Israelis are the victims as much. And isn't this a fundamental crisis for the entity, for the Zionist state, that the loss of narrative control, potentially?
Yeah, I think that's what's really been interesting, I would say, from, again, it's these pivotal moments. And I think the reason I'm talking about these moments is because I think, especially our younger viewers, and I'm told that there's a lot of younger viewers that will be watching, is to understand that, like movements, they happen in journeys. It's peaks and troughs, there's cycles. So when you've been involved in it for a long time, 15, 18, 20, our elders, 30, 40 years, you see that that's what it is. Every time the cycle goes around, 2009, it was alternative media, then 2014, Twitter, then this time Instagram. It keeps pushing it forward. I think what we need to realize is that ultimately, the mainstream media are not our allies. If they're doing that, for example, in 2014, it was the beginning of a time when journalists like me and you were being told that a part of our job is also to tweet as we go. And these are the kind of things that push they by proxy change the narrative, because the journalists will be on the ground and tweeting before the newsroom and the news cycle has time to editorialize for the bulletin. And that's why, talking, for example, of Sky News, you might often notice when you watch live coverage, you are getting a more honest view from your reporter on the ground. When you watch that same reporter's package, which is something he's pre-recorded for the evening edition, you will find a lot less what I would call balanced coverage. You will start seeing their editorial. So it's this kind of thing where the imbalanced editorial in the newsroom used to always dictate what we saw because it was slow and you'd wait for the newspaper or you'd wait for the evening news. But now what we are thinking on a topic is dictating the news cycle. And, that was starting to happen in 2014, and it's a new journalistic ecosystem. And that kind of, as I said, brings me to today, where it's this other watershed moment and the goalposts are being moved again. So none of us as journalists, I don't know if you'd agree with me, Isa, you're more in the news now than I am. I mostly do productions and documentaries, but really none of us thought a year ago that Instagram would become like this primary space for mass mobilization and that the movement for the Palestinian cause would be happening on Instagram, or that it would be the key space for spreading news and virality on Israeli violence. So it's like, again, another round. And I personally have not seen a mobilization like the one that we are currently seeing. So I think like the point I wanted to make by demonstrating this story from 2003 to now is to show ultimately how progress is made. That movements like this, justice movements, they're a journey. It's like a marathon. It's not a sprint. There'll constantly be these peaks and troughs, and each peak will push the boundary a little bit further. Or you have moments like now where it feels like you've actually jumped forward a few steps, but there'll constantly be a pushback. And I think with the mainstream media, you need to see the mainstream media always as part of that pushback. And rather than some sort of ally in the solution, we need to understand how the media works and why the landscape is changing. I've tried to explain some of that. But a fact of the news media is evidently that it's always going to be aligned to an editorial. And that editorial is always going to be aligned to foreign policy positions, investor interests, lobbies. But it's also important to remember that we also have the power. And I think it's that element of mobilization which is changing things. It is not something they're doing actively because they're human rights activists. They don't have a choice. They don't have a choice because they end up getting stuck in their own, I don't want to say their own lies, but in their own parameters of how they say their news is. Then when things become too obvious because everybody else is putting it on the agenda, they don't have a choice but to for it to cover it. And I would just probably end by saying that I think in this peak and trough, in this cycle, what's happened is that honeymoon period with social media, 2009 is done, 11, 14 is done. Now, this round of violence on Palestine has shown that social media platforms are a part of that same pushback. So they're shadow banning, they're taking down content, blocking, restricting hashtags. And we need to remember that social media also has editorial, and that is also always aligned to their ideological positions, their foreign policy positions, their investor interests, their lobbies. And I think that is going to be the new frontier and the new hurdle. But it's also really important to remember that the platform, whether it's mainstream, alternative, or social media, is not the change maker in itself. The people are the change makers. And I would posit that the change in narrative in the mainstream, if and where we're seeing any, is because maintaining the status quo has become harder for them. So I'll just end on that hopeful note. I absolutely agree. This is the biggest crisis I think Israel is facing. They have invested so much time and energy and PR and money into having a stronghold on the narrative in the Western media world, and I think it is well and truly collapsing. Just a reminder as well to everyone that as our job to be that change maker and platform, our job is to amplify Palestinian voices. And that is ultimately what we need to do. And I think the newer generation, I'm sure you feel the same. We're very proud of the newer generation that have come in this round of violence against Palestine. It's a very just struggle, a good cause. And you've really done us proud. But be aware of those cycles. There will be a pushback, but don't be disheartened. Those hurdles they will always be overcome in the end. And don't worry too much in chasing what the mainstream media is saying. They're always playing catch up. They did it in apartheid South Africa. They did it on Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement. And they'll do it with Palestine on Islamophobia. They've never really been on the forefront of social justice change. They've always been, lagging behind and following.
And that's probably, I mean, again, just like with Sister Batool, I think we can talk about these topics for hours, and all of those issues that you're mentioning there at the end. A lot of that is, like you said, to do with the makeup, the ideological makeup, the class barriers, language, race, all of these elements that come into it, which mean that certain narratives are preferred over others, and probably those factors which have formulated the strategy of the Zionist state in its approach to the mainstream media to portray themselves a certain way that garners sympathy with Western audiences. But again, it's the rawness of the images, of the brutality of the occupation and of settler colonialism, and the frankness of settler colonialism, which has meant that they can spend as much time and money as they want. But fundamentally, it's a hard argument to make. Again, we can talk about this for hours. We do have to move on. We're going to try to make this more panel-based as well a little later. Because now what I want to do, inshallah, and Sister Nargess did mention that we want to bring Palestinian voices. We do expect, we're hoping to get Brother Yusuf El Helou, who's a Palestinian journalist, to join us. Our team is still trying to get a hold of him. And inshallah, we can get that perspective again from the Palestinians, because it's their voices that we want to amplify as well. I do want to know, however, inshallah, move on to the next stage of the program, which is going to be led by Sheikh Afzal Merali. The honored Sheikh is an Islamic scholar, and he specializes in Islamic science and law. He's a lecturer at the Hawza Ilmiya in England, and is currently studying for a master's degree in Quranic sciences and tafsir, which is of course the exegesis of the Holy Quran. Sheikh Afzal started his Hawza studies here in the UK before continuing them in both Lebanon and Qom, and he's reached the level of Dars al-Kharij, and is now extremely active in the fields of tabligh, so propagation of the religion of Islam. And inshallah, and this is Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. This is a topic which has always fascinated me, the question of Palestine, the question of Al-Quds from a religious perspective, because I guess you could say that from the viewpoint of those who are from the schools of Islam, which put a priority on the question of the end times and of Quds and the role that it plays, it's something which weaves very heavily into the, for example, some of the groups who are resisting Israel. Their language and imagery is based upon the city of Jerusalem, Al-Quds, from the perspective of our religion as well, the religion of Islam. And as I mentioned in my introduction, Sheikh, you know, Al-Quds is a center of religious holiness, of sacredness, of learning for, of course, the Jewish religion, the Christian religion, and the religion of Islam. And so, for those reasons, you see in the the kind of language employed, for example, by Imam al-Khomeini, the leader of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, the founder of the Islamic Republic, the importance of Al-Quds, making the last Friday of Shahr Ramadan, Al-Quds Day, to revive and keep alive that spirit. And so, Sheikh, we're very honored to have you with us, and inshallah for you to explain and to go through what is the religious duty towards standing with the Palestinian cause. What are perhaps some practical steps people can take to make a positive difference? And something I will definitely come on to as well myself, and I want to really knuckle down on this, the question of Israel, Palestine, Zionism, Quds, in the context of the end times, or at least in the context of the Imam of our time, because, you know, all the followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt, Ajalallah Ta'ala Faraj Sharif, believe, of course, we live in the era of the Imam, and that it's always in that context that issues like this are tackled. So without further ado, Sheikh, we would love to welcome you to the show with a Assalamu alaikum, and we hope that inshallah you can outline this from the perspective of the madhab as well.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran in Surah Al-Isra, سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله. And in the 7th verse of this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, فإذا جاء وعد الآخرة ليسوءوا وجوهكم وليدخلوا المسجد كما دخلوه أول مرة. First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank yourselves for giving me this honor of being able to participate in the show. Due to unforeseen circumstances, I'm not at home to be able to take part. So if there are any lapses in the video, and of course myself also being in the car, I do apologize for that to yourself and to all of the viewers. But because of the importance of this day, the issue of Palestine, I myself did not accept to participate, however possible, in order to voice the what needs to be said about the importance of Palestine in terms of faith. Now, the video, it's just the problem is just due to the StreamYard that we're using. That's why you can't see my video. Sometimes it just clashes like that and it comes and goes.
No,
Okay,
no
now
problem.
it's
Brother.
there.
We have your audio at least. We
Okay.
inshallah we will go with that. But we can see your Nurani face, so please continue.
Jazakumullah afu. With regards, first of all, the religious responsibility that is related to Palestine, the religious responsibility of us all as Muslims. One of the sisters, Sister Batool, I believe, she was talking about the history, as I came to know, of course, the itinerary of this panel, the last 100 years of Palestinian history, and of how the Zionists and the Jewish settlements came about to slowly settle at an increased momentum in the land of Palestine, and how that was actually assisted, and how their presence was nurtured under the British colonialist presence in that part of the world. Up until after the withdrawal of British troops, the State of Israel was declared, etc. Although it is not only that part of Palestinian history that is important. This is actually one of the most important parts or the times of Palestinian history, of recent history. But Palestine itself, so as we try to decipher what is our religious responsibility towards the Palestinian cause, the very first thing is to know its history, but not only its modern recent history, it's to know its general history, because when you know its general religious history, only then will you be able to decipher and to properly fathom its significance. To start, Palestine as a land, it was a place, the Levant itself as a region, as a geographical region, it is somewhere where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, according to some of our narrations, has sent over 70,000 prophets. And there are even archaeological indications that this area was where Nabi Shith alayhi salam, who was the Khalifa of Nabi Adam alayhi salam. So you're talking about over 12,000, 15,000 years ago, where they lived. Habil salamullah alayhi is also buried not very far from the current Palestinian border. Of course, all of this at that time was Bilad al-Sham. And I'm talking right now about very, very early history of mankind. I'm talking about pre-recorded history. When we come towards recorded history, the main landmark that we find is from the time of Nabi Ibrahim salamullah alayhi, who relocated from Babylon, from Iraq, after his encounter and the events that happened with the Namrud of that time, with the Akkadian kings. We find that Nabi Ibrahim salamullah alayhi, when he came over there, and of course right now I'm just shedding light on just some really, really quick, or some snippets, historical snippets, shedding light on them with regards to the history of Palestine, so that we can know and actually behold the importance of this land that witnessed a lot. It witnessed a lot. If you see the time of Nabi Ibrahim salamullah alayhi, after having gone to Egypt for a short period and having come back, Nabi Ibrahim salamullah alayhi, he lived in between Jerusalem, between the city of Khalil, and we find today as it is known as Hebron. And Nabi Ibrahim salamullah alayhi spent his years over there, and he is buried over there as well, and what is known as Al-Haram Al-Ibrahimi. And it is not only himself who is only buried over there, the father of the prophets, or the second father of the prophets, if I were to say, or actually the third father, sorry, Nabi Adam, Nabi Nuh, and Nabi Adam and Nabi Ibrahim salamullah alayhi, the second father. The prophets that followed from his lineage, from both the side of Nabi Ismail and the side of Nabi Ishaq salamullah alayhima, we find that all of them had a part, had certain events. They spent their lives over there. And when you talk about prophets preaching not only to Bani Israel, but also preaching to the Canaanites, to the Canaanites, who were there before the Israelite presence. I don't say Israeli, but the Israelite presence of that time, the original Israelite presence, the actual Israelite presence. We find that Nabi Ibrahim salamullah alayhi, those prophets who came, even when Nabi Yusuf had asked his brothers to come back or to come to him in Egypt, in Memphis, after a few generations, Nabi Musa alayhi, he took them back over there to Palestine. And when they would not enter, they did not want to face the Canaaniyin to actualize that promise that Allah had given them as a nation that had believed in him. Not because they just had self-worth or had self-virtue, no, because they were a believing nation, and this was a holy place that Allah had destined for a believing people. So they themselves were there just as an example, or unfortunately at that time the only example of a believing nation. And had there been another believing nation as well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have given them preference to the Israelites of that time. So to use this logic that we were the chosen people of God, and this was promised to us 3,000-4,000 years ago, that means even today this also applies. I do beg to differ. This logic itself does not hold strong. It does not hold true. After that, the events that happened from the time of the judges who were there in a period when there were no prophets, or after the demise of Nabi Musa sallallahu alayhi, up until they entered over there and Dawood alayhi salam fought in the army of Talut, the king of the time, etc. To know that history. The first point is to know all of that rich history, okay? And how these people, how these prophets preached to them. How do they live? How did they receive the teachings of those prophets? Were they always believing during all of those times? What are the similarities of many prophets that we as Muslims believe in, and the Jews also they used to believe in? Okay, and sometimes we read the Holy Quran. Some prophets, they're not even mentioned by name. Like for example, when Allah Subhanahu wa Taala refers to the story of Talut himself, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says that Banu Israel spoke. They spoke to a prophet of theirs. A prophet of theirs. This prophet of theirs, we find that in Christian, we find that in the Testament, in the Old and New Testament, we find that this person, he is referred to as Nabi Samuel. He was a prophet that we also believe in. So it is a place that also the three religions, all of us, which in essence the three original religions, they were a continuation of the same message, without, if we do not look at the distortions, okay, in the first and Christianity and in Judaism today. So it is a place in which all of these religions meet. In addition to that as well, to know its religious significance, we need to know, okay, it is a place where prophets trod. Do you know that sometimes when prophets would come, it is a place where revelation used to descend. It is a place that has Masjid al-Aqsa. Masjid al-Aqsa itself, it was a place that angels used to come and they used to speak with Sayyidah Maryam salamullahi alayha. If we refer to, for example, when Nabi Zakaria salamullahi alayhi, he asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Hunalika da'a Zakaria Rabba. It was there in the temple of Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam in Al-Quds, okay, and which where Nabi Zakaria salamullahi alayhi, he prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant him a child. So it is a place in which dua is mustajab. According to our Islamic literature, the religious significance of Masjid al-Aqsa, especially, it is considered to be one of the grand mosques. One of the grand mosques. The verses that I read also, this importance that is given to Masjid al-Aqsa, that it was the first Qibla. It does not end by the fact that we changed our Qibla, that Allah changed our Qibla towards the Holy Kaaba. No, on the contrary. It was, first of all, it was also a place in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or from which Allah took his prophet to the heavenly ascension. You would ask yourself, one should ask themselves, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala limited by geography that he needed to bring this prophet at night from his bed, right? From Mecca, he needed to take him all the way to Palestine. And then from there, to take him all the way up from Masjid al-Aqsa, there must be a significance. In addition to that, the second verse that I recited, inshallah, I will quote it when I talk about the third point that you asked, the relation with with the dhuhr of our Imam al-Hujjah Ajjallahu Ta'ala Farajahu Sharif. The third point, after knowing its history, number two, knowing its religious significance, especially of those special sites and the shrines of the different prophets and of the different saints. Thirdly, our responsibility is to know about the oppression that the Palestinian people are facing. You need to go and actively do a research and listen to people who are actually telling you the truth. Listening to the mainstream media outlets, you're not going to get the truth. Just like the sisters before me, they have been, especially Sister Nargess has been explaining the fact that a lot of these news, they have been filtered through the editorial process in order for you to get a distorted, tainted narrative. That like for example, a few days ago, I was watching a small clip of BBC saying exactly, and this was actually just in one sentence. The number, my memory does not serve me well, but let's say a number of approximately, let's say 10 Palestinians died and 2 Israelis were killed. So the Palestinians who died, they died due to natural causes, but the Israelis, they were killed by the missiles, right?
Yeah.
So imagine, look at how hypocritical the BBC is. Very, very hypocritical. Imagine.
Many outlets as well. Many outlets. Exactly the same.
Many outlets. It's an example. It's just an example. And these news outlets, due to the audacity of their hypocrisy and trying to feed us this distorted narrative in this disproportionate way, it is only fit for us to shame them, to name them. These people are 1, 2, 3. To be bold enough to mention that. Okay, to be bold enough.
In the context of and you were touching a point there, the modern era, from let's say a perspective of people who believe, and by the way, the school of thought that you subscribe to in the religion of Islam, whether it is from the school of Ahlul Bayt or any of the other schools of Islam, they're all the schools believe that in the coming of Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu Ta'ala Farajahu Sharif, whether he's born yet or not, it's a different discussion, but he will come, and a discussion about the return of Isa alayhi salam. And there are many, and you know, I think a lot of this narrative has been exacerbated because we live in a very odd time anyway. There's a lot of, it's a very surreal context we're living in now with the pandemic and with many people questioning, people from other religions. Is this the end times? Is this the punishment from God? Is this the mark of the beast coming? Is this Dajjal coming? What is this system being built upon all of us? And there are some who make that connection with Al-Quds and with Israel from the brothers and sisters, Muslim brothers and sisters, people from the Ahlul Kitab, the people of the books, Christians, and some Jews, that all of these events are happening in that context. And there are those who believe that Jerusalem will be the capital from where the so-called Antichrist or a Dajjal or some type of figure hostile to God and those who believe in God will be based and ruled from. In your research or in your understanding of the contextualization in these times, is that something which is reflected in some of the hadith? What is the role of Al-Quds at the end of time, or the position of Al-Quds at the end of time?
Thank you. This is a really important question. Let me just quickly number a few points that I wanted to mention. Just number them without any depth of explanation, and then I come to answer this. Amongst the practical points, before again talking about the connection with the end of time, the practical points and tips that we need to focus on as people, let's say people especially who are living in the West, our responsibility towards Palestine and the Palestinian cause. First of all, it's to, in addition to knowing the history, religious significance, knowing about the oppression, in general, it is after knowing, we need to ask about our responsibility. And one of the ways is actually through us referring or diverting towards activism. And this is something that is extremely necessary, okay? And this is, for example, first of all, to spread the awareness about what is happening. It is my responsibility. If I can't help them in any way, at least let me share in spreading the news of the oppression that they're facing, the apartheid that they're facing. So, in addition to that as well, it is necessary for us living in democratic countries that are lands of law, We need to write to our MPs. It is really important, right? Sometimes there are some of the activist brothers and sisters, they create a template, just write your name at least, but write to them and make sure that you write and you receive the response. The thing is that I was reading a response from one of the conservatives MPs actually, and I was reading actually in between the lines, and even though they are supposed, in order to be impartial, to respond from both sides, but when I was actually reading between the lines, I found that the conscience of that MP, or at least not the conscience, but the sheer amount of pressure that is now being put in exposing the Israeli atrocities towards the Palestinians, now they're starting to gain a really important momentum. Now the mass media slowly, there are certain figures, or for example, certain presenters, certain hosts, etc. They are speaking about it, even though there is a backlash, but they are speaking about it now. People are starting to get that courage. As you speak, you're giving more courage to other people who can also influence. Aid where possible, donate where possible. I also do suggest that our youth especially need to get more so into the media and politics, and also protest where there are protests, taking part in them, finally boycotting Israeli products, okay, boycotting them. This is something that will help. As for the relation with the zuhur of the Imam al-Hujj alayhi salam, Allah Ta'ala Farajahu Sharif, as you mentioned, now whether we believe in this, in our Imam alayhi salam, according to the Shia that he's already born and he's in occultation, or according to our brothers Ahl Sunnah who believe that he is not born yet, but they believe in him as a person, or even the Christians, they believe in the final advent and the coming of the Messiah. The Jews as well, they believe that the Messiah did not come the first time, that Nabi Isa was not the Messiah, but that he will come again. The thing is, this relation is mentioned in Surah Al-Isra in the 7th verse, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that, and when they come the second time, right? When the second promise will come, those servants of Allah who have strength, they will come and they will enter the masjid as they entered it the first time. A rough translation. The thing is, Masjid al-Aqsa, it is not the start point of the activities and the battle of Dhuhr. It is not the start point. It is, you could say, one of the end points, because Nabi Isa alayhi salam, according to our narrations, will not descend immediately as soon as the Dhuhr of the Imam alayhi salam happens. The zuhur will happen, and it will also happen in a few goes until the Imam alayhi salam openly he comes back and he appears, and then his followers, they gather around him. Then he will start to have a momentum. His army will form, and of course the main arch enemy of the Imam al-Hujj alayhi salam is actually the Sufyani, who will be around the Levant area. As for the arch enemy of Nabi Isa alayhi salam, he is the Dajjal. Now, whether it is a person, a one-eyed person, or a system, in the end, that has to be seen. Those ulama who consider him to be a system, again, this is an attempt to actually interpret this, because of the fact that in some narrations, the feats, the supernatural feats that are ascribed to a Dajjal, they may seem to be a little bit too much for certain scholars to take at their literal understanding. The Imam alayhi salam, he will come over there, again showing the significance of Masjid al-Aqsa. Nabi Isa alayhi salam will also come. Now again, the Nabi Isa and all of the prophets, they believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They believed in the general Islam, but considering the fact that from the time that the Islam, the final set of laws in the framework of the Islam bil ma'na al-khas, the Islam with the specific meaning, this Islam, not the general Islam that all prophets believe in, like believing in one God, in prophethood and the day of Qiyamah. No, this Islam with the Imamah, this Islam which had these ahkam, these sets of laws. Nabi Isa alayhi salam will come and we will also believe in them, and he will also spread them. And he will pray behind the Imam al-Hujj Allah Ta'ala Farajahu Sharif, as is mentioned that these followers or these servants of Allah will enter the masjid. Okay, again showing that significance and that importance. Now, according to my humble research in history, or in the advents of Zuhur, the events of Zuhur, the history of the Zuhur, it seems that according to some of my teachers, and I'm not describing this to myself, they are they research, and according to their opinion is it is as follows: that during the time of Dhuhr, the Imam alayhi salam will come and he will face the Sufyani. But so the main armies around that area, it will actually be the Sufyanis. The Sufyani and his followers, they will be in charge of that area, having taken control just a few months prior. Any other political entities or countries, sovereign countries, it seems that he will have had taken over that area of the Levant. So what seems is that either the fact that he will have subdued the Zionist presence, or what seems to be very likely, that Palestine will have been freed from the Zionist presence by that time. This is also a possibility. But again, the Masjid al-Aqsa itself, it will have this symbol, it will have this significance of the fact that it is where the beginning of that divine global government of justice will start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheikh. Again, another intriguing speech that I could have really continued for many, many hours. It's just a shame the constraints of time mean that we can't go into these issues with the depth that they perhaps deserve from yourself, of course, Sister Batool and Sister Nargess. But we do want to, inshallah, welcome them back because we do have a few questions from some of our viewers on YouTube. And Assalamu alaikum. You guys, just an update, we've been trying to get hold of Brother Yusuf El Helou, but still it doesn't seem we can get through to him. We will, of course, inshallah, keep trying to the very end. But while we have everyone here, I'm going to take a few questions, and I think this first one I want to direct it to Sister Batool, because this is maybe a political question. And we've seen everything going on in the context of the 11-day conflict that we've just seen, or the 11-day attack on Gaza, and what preceded that. And we see many people now looking at Benjamin Netanyahu, the leader of the entity there, and the political problems he's had leading up to that conflict or that war, that attack, and his, almost you could say, political downfall, which was kind of in the works anyway, but looks to be have been cemented by that conflict, and the incoming leadership of Naftali Bennett, who is deemed to be even more to the right of Benjamin Netanyahu. And, you know, if anyone had the impression that Israel was a friendly, liberal, you know, peace-loving state, or however they want to portray themselves, yeah, Netanyahu's been kicked out. But for somebody who they feel will do a better job of occupying and colonizing Palestine and killing Palestinians, a man who's admitted in the past he's killed Arabs, and quite proud of the fact. What impact, Sister, do you think that change is going to make on the situation on the ground, and perhaps in the calculations and some of the forces who are opposing what's happening there with regards to Zionism?
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question. I've never believed that there was such thing as a right and a left when it comes to the wrong state. In my opinion, it was all just one and the same. Even if you, for example, want to talk about the left wing, right, as they term it, the two-state solution, those who are proponents of the two-state solution, for example, just to give an example here, you see that in the 1990s, the greatest amount of annexation of Palestinian land on Palestinian territories occurred under Rabin. So the same prime minister who was assassinated, who actually heralded the Oslo Accords with Yasser Arafat. For example, you see that the maximum amount of annexation when it came to the West Bank occurred at that point, and all the promises that they made, they reneged on it and they turned their backs against it. So those promises that they made for the Palestinians. And we see, for example, how the Palestinian authorities right now are doing the dirty job for the wrong state. So just to give you an example, so does it make a difference if you had someone like Naftali in power or someone like Netanyahu in power? No, it's just all about how they frame themselves on the outset. Now, you raised a very interesting question if we talk about the balance of forces on the ground. I think what is profound and that we need to touch upon as much as possible, and we need to emphasize, is actually what were the, let's say, the repercussions or the consequences of this 11-day war, as you've explained. So it's very interesting to see that it was actually the wrong state that initiated the ceasefire after that 11-day onslaught on Gaza. And actually, I would argue very strongly that the culmination of events throughout actually led to a significant victory for the Palestinian struggle for justice, notwithstanding, of course, all of the brutal death and destruction that the people of Palestine have faced and continue to face. So take, for example, the very fact that the wrong state had to fight on three fronts. It had to fight those in Gaza, it had to fight those in the West Bank, it had to fight those even within the 1948 borders. You had Palestinians living within the 48 borders who began mass mobilizing. And there was actually this inherent assumption that they had integrated into the wrong state and that they had no psychology to rise up. This very notion has been crushed. So they became an uncalculated force of fear for the wrong state because they formed a local front within the heart of the wrong state. So that's, victory number one. Victory number two, you could say how the resistance in Gaza came to actually defend Jerusalem. It had gone from defending itself to becoming a source of liberation for other parts of occupied Palestine. So we see that how Jerusalem has been defined as the compass. And we see that actually, as far as the resistance goes, there are now new rules of engagements on the ground that equate attacking Jerusalem to a full-scale war. And so decisive conclusions have been established simply due to the change in the balance of forces on the ground. And this is something that I alluded to previously. It is only through armed struggle and armed resistance can you get the balance of forces to change on the ground, which then reflects on a higher level when it comes to international law, for example, and actually abiding by these rules. Another very important point that I want to make here. Yeah,
really apologies to interrupt there. Yeah. And just to point out that there are a number of international law treaties, are there not, that cement the right of occupied people, wherever, not just in occupied Palestine. There's a principle in international law, isn't there, that cements and, what's the word that I'm looking for, codifies the right of people unoccupied to even armed resistance.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. And so it's very interesting that you see whenever you have any Palestinian solidarity activists that go on to mainstream media, the first question they ask is, when will you condemn the rocket attacks on Hamas? For example, of course, you've raised a very legitimate point, but let's just put even this whole idea of international law on the side. Look at the United Resistance Front. That is something also that was a consequence that we've seen from this 11-day war. We've seen how the 11-day war was only between the wrong state and Gaza. The Syrian and the Lebanese war fronts at that point were not opened. But despite this, we see that the Palestinian resistance caused massive harm to the wrong state. For example, it launched 4,000 rockets. So it became clear to the West that if the wrong state increased their war against Gaza and crossed any further red lines, that other resistance forces that are now within a united pact and a united front would get involved. So these include the PMU in Iraq, for example, the Houthis in Yemen, the IRGC in Iran. So it became apparent that the issue would become much stronger than it is, and is actually a real source of threat to the existence of the wrong state. So this coordination between the axis of resistance is very, very important. And that's why we see that the wrong state were not patient and could not go further than 11 days. And as you said very rightly, you see that now the population of the wrong state of Israel are obviously mad at Netanyahu. Like, how dare you, within 11 days, that's probably the shortest span of time in which they've issued, they themselves have come forward to issue a ceasefire, just shows you the extent to which they have failed. They haven't managed to target any of the resistant buildings, compounds, or targets within Gaza. Is it really, considered a win or a gain for the fact that they've led to the death and destruction of and massacring of 250 Palestinian men, women, and children, the desecration of mosques and holy sites, the bombing of schools and hospitals, etc. Is that really considered a gain? Is that really considered a win? And it's really interesting when you look at the fact that the Israeli population, someone like Netanyahu, he felt so emboldened to go into war because he felt like he would be voted in on the premise that he is fighting the people of Gaza. Again, this shows you the kind of psychology that exists within the settlers of the wrong state. The very fact that they would approve of this man the moment that he decides to fire rockets into Gaza and massacre defenseless men, women, and children. And when this comes to a halt, that's when someone like him gets booted out. So that's another thing that is very, pertinent to understand in the actual psychology of the settlers. Because when people think of the wrong state settlers, they think, oh, they're Israeli civilians. That's the way it's framed in the mainstream media. But this is the type of people that we're dealing with. But I mean, I could go on and on, but I think I'll just stop here.
No, absolutely. And because we do have more questions coming in, and one of them is and I'll put this to Sister Nargess as well, because of course Sister Batool there just obviously outlined kind of the situation on the ground and how the struggle in Al-Quds became related to the struggle in Gaza. But all of this also, of course, started in the neighborhood of Sheikh al-Jarrah. Sister Nargess, can you tell us more about kind of what happened in the neighborhood? How is that a reflection, perhaps, as some have said, of that was just a microcosm of what happened with the Nakba in 1948? Sister Nargess, if you can come off mute, if possible.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just want to add a few things, though, to what Sister Batool said there, because I think we need to be really careful, especially now, unfortunately, Yusuf wasn't able to join us. So we've missed out on having a Palestinian voice. And I think it's really, really important to understand that this conflict is rooted in Palestinian people. There's a lot of factors and there's a lot of things around that as well. But when we're talking about what's happened on the ground, I just want to clarify a little bit what's happened on the ground with Israelis and what's happened on the ground with Palestinians. What has happened is a unifying of Palestinian factions unlike we've seen ever before, independent on anything else happening outside of Palestine. When there's been people coming in from Jordan or Syria or the borders from other places, it's been Palestinians. And I think it's really important. As I said, I was in Iran, for example. When you're in Iran, that's got a very pro-Palestinian position historically since the Iranian Revolution till now. It's not to say that there is not solidarity, there is not allyship and things going on, but it's really important to always, whether we are from a media perspective or a political perspective, always understanding that we should always amplify the Palestinian position. One of the most important things that have happened is the unification of the Palestinian voice. What's so interesting this time is to see the ambassador and representatives of the PLO and elsewhere not fall for the kind of questions Sister Batool was saying when they kept being asked about Hamas. So it was a very unifying thing. The other thing is about Israel, just the Israeli population. We know that one of the reasons this attack took place is one of the reasons attacks on Gaza usually take place, war takes place, is because it's a unifying factor in Israel. Israeli populations unify at a time of war. Criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu by the coalition who is just going to oust him, it seems, in the next few days. The criticism was not that he did the aggression, or that he failed. It was that he did not go hard enough, that he did not continue. So I think that's a really, that's an important thing to remember. The opinions kind of, that opinion on the ground is there. It's not that they were, oh, why did you go to war? And, oh, we think you should go now because, no, it was that he was not strong enough. And of course, we know Naftali was his former defense minister, and it's a strange coalition there now in Israel because it's the left wing, the center right, and the far right of Benjamin Netanyahu, just wanting to get rid of a figurehead. Benjamin Netanyahu's been in power for a really long time. Going to Sheikh Jarrah, I think that was the catalyst for this movement. It's not just Sheikh Jarrah. And as you said, this is just a continuation. It's just a continuation of what's been happening since the creation of the state of Israel. You've seen so many times that every Israeli city was once Sheikh Jarrah. That's the way every village that we now see as an Israeli village within the borders, whether it's 1948, the creation, 1967, whatever, that was always a Sheikh Jarrah. I think the main thing that's changed is, and I didn't mention this in my talk, is mobile footage. They can film it, they can put it out, and I think it's now definitely a tipping point has been reached. I don't think we're anywhere near the end. But certainly a tipping point has reached where I think first the Western space, so in a society like Britain, they're going to have to change how they're discussing this. Is it changing inside? Is the dialogue changing inside Israel? Like Isa, I don't know, or Batool, I don't know. I don't see much indication that it's changing. I don't think there is.
I think as you mentioned, it's probably changing to the right, to the more extreme, and you see it in all nations born out of settler colonialism, like the United States. It's almost like it's baked into the DNA of the society. Violence and aggression, and there's only one way it can really go, which is, of course, as we're seeing, a more radicalized population amongst the Israelis. And I just wonder, somebody like a Netanyahu, for all of his critics against him, is actually a very skilled statesman. The way he presents Israel to the outside world is, of course, as we know, very different to the reality of Israel internally. And I just wonder whether somebody like Naftali Bennett will be like the Donald Trump of Israel. And what I mean by that is Donald Trump was very honest about his intentions and motives in the region. Like, for example, with Syria, when they moved soldiers to the occupied parts of northern Syria, Donald Trump was very open that we're just there to guard the oil fields. Whereas perhaps under more skilled orators and presidents, it would have been about democracy and human rights and liberalism and all these like cozy sounding words. And I just wonder whether Naftali Bennett will be that kind of, unpolished, unspinnable narrative where he's going to be very aggressive in his stance on the global stage with a president like Biden. And
we have to wait and see if it lasts, the coalition, which I think that is a question, because it's a very tenuous coalition that's been brought together on the sole premise of getting Netanyahu out. Yeah. I'm not convinced that it's going to last, because once Netanyahu has gone and he's facing corruption charges, whether such a fragile coalition can remain, and ultimately it is a centre party that has done this deal. There's been 4 elections in a very short period of time in Israel, and I don't think that what's happening, Israel is a reflection of a European and North American model of democracy, and it's facing the kind of challenges we're facing here, where there's a deep crisis in the establishment and everything keeps getting pushed right. It's fragile and it keeps breaking down.
That was the exact word I was going to use, because if Naftali Bennett doesn't manage to keep somehow his government together, that's like it's a deep-rooted crisis that goes to the very heart of what Israel is supposed to be, and it could see the country without government for years to come.
Well, it has been, in essence, been in limbo for the last 2 years, because there's been no healthcare budget. Here we've seen, Israel is the bastion of the COVID vaccine, but actually the protests on the ground in Israel over the last 6 months have been over Netanyahu's handling of COVID. And because there's been this stalemate of constant elections and them not being able to find a coalition, that is what is creating that stalemate. The problem, of course, is that that's very dangerous for Palestinians, because what Israel generally does to get out of political crises is to bomb Palestinians, is to be more forceful, because somehow there seems to be some sort of correlation between a unifying factor of the factions inside Israel and this violence with Palestine. And what's been interesting on the Israeli front anyway this time has been that for the first time it didn't work. I'm not that deep of an Israeli expert, but I would say that certainly 11 days might have also been because it wasn't doing the trick. For the first time, bombing Gaza did not quiet down Israeli criticism of Benjamin Netanyahu. It continued. Usually it's like this factor that just brings everyone together. And we saw for the first time that this didn't happen.
Sister Batool, we just saw, Nargess talking about amplifying Palestinian voices, and I think she's right in that social media really, the one thing that I think is the lasting image from this, all the events of, let's say, the last month, not just the actual conflict, the 11-day war, is that video of that settler saying, if I don't steal your house, somebody else will. And it's so clear and goes to the very heart of how Israel was founded, that, it's now able for Palestinians to say, this is the message we've been trying to send for 73, if not 100 years. And now they're able to do so.
Yeah, but we have to understand that also Israel, or those Israeli settlers, they say these things because they're being protected by America, right? America provides Israel with that political cover. And even if you look at some tapes released of Netanyahu, for example, in a way to calm himself down, he says, we've got America's support. America is behind us, so we have nothing to worry about. So this kind of impunity that we see from their side is because they genuinely feel protected. I think the moment the Israeli settlers feel like they don't have that protection, that's when they're really in that state of crisis. And I think one of the things that this 11-day war also kind of revealed was the state of demographic fragility and vulnerability, that was manifested by the Israeli settlers' fear of, for example, the Palestinian rocket attacks. The success of the resistance has been effectively through the aspect of morale, so for example, forcing these settlers to interrupt their lives and hide in shelters when the alert sounds come on. And that's enough to cause that kind of substantial fear. And I think, the prospect that the settlers, for example, are targets in any upcoming future war, due to the rockets that were manifested, like, for example, the Ayash rockets that were 200 miles in range that could cover the whole of the wrong state, they are enough to make the settlers want to pack their bags and flee back to places they came from. And prospective settlers are not deterred. So I think that's a whole part of the crisis that you see right now in the wrong state, is that the wrong state actually, it's gone from a place of actually expanding itself to a place of just wanting to preserve itself. It's at the state where it's trying to deter its enemy and it's trying to weaken its enemy. But as you say, of course, just getting back to the point of amplifying the Palestinian voices, I think it's more important than ever right now that we show the world that whilst there's two sides, there's a death, there's a mayhem, and there's a destruction that the wrong state is causing. But I think we need to also amplify the role of the resistance on the ground and actually show people that there is hope that Palestine can be freed, and there's hope that the balance of forces on the ground can change. Because I don't want people to fret, or I don't want people to feel like, halas, this is a dead end and there's no way that we can get out of this. No, there's two sides to this that we have to kind of present. We have to present the ugly and monstrous face of the wrong state and all the crimes that they're committing, but we also need to kind of show the world the strength also of the resistance on the ground, and actually how the wrong state is weaker than the spider's web in terms of its geographic vulnerability, its demographic vulnerability, and fragility, and its ability to sustain itself, because ultimately its existence had no basis and had no legitimacy.
Apologies, I'm just on mute there. Thank you, Sister Batool and Sister Nargess. We appear, I'm very disappointed to say that we didn't manage to get hold of Brother Yusuf. I'm not sure whether he had some technical problems on his end. Our team were trying to get hold of him, and it really would have, I think, enriched also our understanding of the region to hear it from the perspective of a Palestinian voice. But, inshallah, this is just going to be the first of many events that we organize, because, of course, as the title of this show is, Palestine 101. It is just a very brief overview of trying to understand the situation. And we've gone quite literally from the beginning of time until the end of time and everything in between in only this short space of time. And I would really, really love to thank yourselves for joining us and helping us with that. And also Sheikh Afzal, who sadly had to leave us halfway through the show. But of course, his contribution was fantastic. And I hope that everyone who watched live with us and will watch the video later on has managed to perhaps take something away from this that will educate and also inform their understanding of the region going forward. But I have to say that, I've personally learnt a lot today, and also agree with the thrust here that we perhaps haven't quite understood the long-term consequences of what's happened over the last month and how much of a game changer this was. Because, as much as people look at the crises there and look at the sad scenes of the heartbreaking scenes of children dying and losing their fathers and their mothers and family members mourning each other, there are also, as you say, shoots of hope as well that we look to And we always put our faith in God that there are shoots of hope as well for the Palestinian people and all the oppressed people around the world. Again, thank you, Sister Nargess. Thank you, Sister Batool. It's been fascinating. Thank you all to the viewers as well who submitted questions. And I guess I will just leave the last words to you guys before we say goodbye.
Go ahead, Sister. After you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Brother Eisa, for the amazing hosting and for the contributions from Sister Nargess and Sheikh Afzal. It's honestly, the pleasure is all mine, and I've learned so much. And may we, inshallah, all keep the momentum going. This is an ongoing cause. And as I stressed in the beginning, the salvation for humanity will come about with the freedom of Palestine. Because if we can guarantee the freedom of Palestine, then we're guaranteeing that we're not exceeding the boundaries of human rights, essentially. And so this is the cause for all of humanity, and all of us need to rally behind it. So with whatever capacity we have, inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept.
Thank you, Sister.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. And Eisa, you said that you have these events, I'm assuming relatively regularly. I will just leave with something that is a bit, not in the media area, but the advice I always give when talking on topics, especially on Palestine, especially if you're a young person or you're new to this type of activism, educate yourself, not just on the kind of things we've been talking about and we've been talking to you about, but about your rights under freedom of laws in this country, your rights in schools, if you've been facing any problems, because I know that's one thing we didn't have time to touch upon. There's been a lot of backlash in schools, in workplaces. There are organisations, IHRC and Cage being two in the UK, that can help you. If you have been facing any backlash, knowing your rights and educating yourself and arming yourself with facts is one of the best things you can do in your activism and for this cause. And I would encourage to hold events and to have people, legal experts and things like that, to tell you those types of rights. Be confident, be hopeful, as Batool had said. Be confident in what you're saying. When you know your rights, you can do that very well. And be hopeful, because there is a lot of hope in this cause. And we know, as we've learned from other struggles that have faced similar trajectories, that in the end there is victory, there is freedom, and there is justice to be gained.
Sister, sorry, I'm just actually getting the email address, and I'm hoping to put this, and I'll speak it out, which is basically an email address of an organization called the Left Legal Fighting Fund as well, which is now opening up a unit to take into account people who have been victims. So what we've been seeing happening in schools is young people standing up for Palestine, waving flags, putting up banners, having debates in class, and in some cases being shut down by their teachers and gaslit and being told that what you're doing is offensive, is potentially anti-Semitic. And we've seen, of course, many discussions about the weaponization of the anti-Semitism slur. And so if anyone has experienced anything like that with their school, we've heard stories of people being expelled from schools. We're in touch with children who have been threatened with expulsions. info@fightingfund.org. So that's info@fightingfund.org. If anyone is in that situation, to contact that email address, as well as the organizations that Sister Nargess mentioned, such as IHRC, and those groups will be able to help to take up any issues that you're facing, will help to take up and help advise you, and also give you access to legal support as well. So there are dedicated teams now dealing with this. It's going along the bottom, info@fightingfund.org. If you've been at school, you've been threatened by teachers or gaslit or accused of certain things which are against the rights that Sister Nargess mentioned there. So inshallah, if anyone is watching this or able to share it, info@fightingfund.org, as well as the other groups. And on that note, again, I would like to thank both of you and Sheikh Afzal for his time, and the viewers as well for joining us and sharing their questions and comments as well. On that note, I'd like to say assalamu alaikum to the viewers, to our two sisters, and to the organizers as well. And inshallah, when the next event is currently or will be organized, we can see and have our dear guests with us. So for myself, Yusuf El Helou, and our guest, good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. And please remember the people all over the world who are oppressed in your eyes. Inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
sending a strong message today. Let me hear you say free, 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 free.